first bark shattered the quiet like a gunshot. Mason Hale spun toward the old lighthouse stairs as his dog clawed at the metal floor, frantic, desperate, digging at something hidden beneath years of rust. Then clang, a hollow echo rose from below, not the sound of pipes, but of space. He pried the ring free, and cold air breathed up, carrying the scent of salt and oil, and something older. Outside, through the cracked glass, faint lights flickered on the water, 3 figures moving toward shore without flashlights. Mason's hand tightened on the hatch. Whatever was buried here, someone else was coming for it. The ferry left behind only the smell of diesel and the faint groan of the tide rolling under the dock. Mason Hale stood with a duffel on his shoulder and the wind at his back, staring at the strip of land that was now apparently his, Greywater Island. 37 acres of stubborn rock, crabgrass, and a lighthouse that hadn't guided anything but gulls for 30 years. Echo trotted down the ramp ahead of him, nose low, tail stiff, padding straight through puddles without hesitation. The dog didn't bark, didn't pull ahead, just moved with that soldier's rhythm Mason recognized too well. They had both learned the same language once: observe first, move second. The island was a bruise in the fog-gray sand, black rock, one crooked road disappearing toward the lighthouse bluff. Mason adjusted the strap of his duffel and started walking. His boots sank in mud that smelled like copper and salt. The sound of the ferry's engine faded until there was nothing left but wind, gulls, and the distant, intermittent pulse of waves striking stone. He hadn't wanted this place. It had come in a lawyer's envelope, a surprise inheritance from a distant uncle he barely remembered. One structure of historical value, the letter read, including associated acreage and assets. Mason had read the words twice, thinking of property taxes, repairs, insurance, everything a man without steady work didn't need. But he'd come anyway, because debts don't forgive themselves, and sometimes a broken thing still has salvage. By the time he reached the rise, the fog had thinned enough to show the tower. 50 feet of weather-beaten concrete, paint peeled to its bones, the red cap leaning slightly to the left like an old man's hat. At its base squatted the keeper's cottage, 2 rooms, 1 chimney, 1 door hanging askew. He exhaled, a sound between disbelief and resignation. "Home, huh?" he muttered. Echo sat beside him, ears angled forward, gaze fixed on the structure as if evaluating fortifications. Mason rubbed the dog's neck absently. "Don't get used to it. We're just here to fix and sell." But even as he said it, he knew the words didn't quite fit in his mouth. Inside, the cottage smelled of salt, mildew, and dusted coal. The floorboards creaked under each step. He opened every window and let the wind muscle through, clearing the air. Sunlight fell in pale shafts, cutting across a room full of ghosts. A kerosene lamp still half full, a coil of rope on a peg, a table with rings from coffee cups that had outlived their owners. Echo prowled ahead, nails ticking, sniffing corners like a customs officer. The dog's fur brushed Mason's jeans each time he passed, as if confirming, yes, it's safe enough for now. In the bedroom, a trunk sat under the window, covered by a canvas tarp. Mason knelt, lifted the lid. Inside, a stack of nautical charts, a brass compass cracked at the hinge, and a photograph of a man standing beside the same lighthouse, younger by decades. The man's eyes were pale and sharp. The caption scrawled on the back read, "Jonas Hale, Keeper, 1973. Mason stared at the name for a long time. He'd been 6 when his uncle visited once an afternoon of quiet conversation between adults, Mason half hidden behind the screen door, too shy to speak. He remembered only the smell of tobacco and sea brine, and the man's voice low and deliberate. Now that voice was gone, leaving behind a pile of rust and paperwork that said inheritance. He dropped the photo back in the trunk. "Guess you didn't plan for company, huh?" Echo sneezed as if in agreement. Mason spent the next few hours inspecting. The lighthouse door was swollen shut but gave way with a shove. The spiral stair inside was intact, though flakes of paint drifted with every step. The lantern room's glass was cracked on the west side. Wiring, dead. Generators, ancient. He took notes out of habit, years of military precision that refused to die. Replace windows. Check cistern integrity. Verify property boundary. Locate electrical feed, if any. Test radio. The list grew, but so did the sense of scale. This wasn't a weekend fix, it was a life's work. By late afternoon, the wind turned colder. Mason set up his cot near the wood stove, spread a blanket for Echo, and boiled water for coffee that tasted faintly of rust. The first sip hit like regret, familiar and warm. The quiet stretched. It wasn't peace. It was the heavy kind of silence that remembered noise, the crash of waves, the chatter of a crew, the sharp report of orders barked across static. Mason still caught himself listening for radio squelch, the voice of command that hadn't spoken in years. He'd been out of the service for almost 4, but the body doesn't retire as easily as the uniform. He still woke at 0430, still checked exits before sleeping, still kept boots beside the bed. He'd left with a medical discharge and a shoulder full of metal that twitched when rain came in sideways. But the real wound was quieter, a single flare that didn't fire, and the 2 men who never made it back. He didn't talk about it. Not to the VA counselors, not to his ex-wife, not to the men at the Legion who nodded too quickly and changed the subject. He'd built walls instead, thin, temporary ones, and told himself he preferred silence. But now silence was all he had. Echo adjusted easily. He slept near the door the first night, facing out. No whining, no pacing. Every few hours, Mason woke to hear the dog's steady breathing and the faraway groan of the sea. Around 2 a.m., the wind shifted, carrying the smell of kelp and diesel. Echo's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Mason lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling the island breathe through the boards. Morning came gray and brittle. The tide was out, revealing a field of slick stone and barnacle. Mason cooked oatmeal on a camp stove, fed the dog, and sat on the steps with his notebook. The air felt raw, like the first breath after a long dive. He sketched a quick map dock, cottage, tower, cliffside trail, and marked the boundary stakes he'd passed. But something didn't line up. The property map from the lawyer showed a straight southern fence line, yet on the ground the posts veered east. He pulled out the county survey he'd picked up in town. Same discrepancy. Either the ocean's moved, he said aloud, or someone's been creative with paperwork. Echo tilted his head, as if voting for the second option. That afternoon, Mason drove the old generator back to life long enough to test the radio. Static. He turned the dial slowly, chasing a faint channel until a voice cracked through weather broadcast. Gale warning north of the shoals. Expect heavy swells by Thursday. 3 days. Plenty of time, he told himself, but something in his gut tightened anyway. He walked the perimeter before dusk. The easement line, if that's what it was, cut through an overgrown trench near the cliff. Half buried in sand was a row of metal stakes connected by a single rusted cable. Mason crouched, brushed away moss. The stakes were stamped with numbers coordinates maybe, and one bore the faint emblem of the Maritime Reserves Authority, dated 1981. Government issue. He frowned. The lawyer hadn't mentioned any federal claim. Back at the cottage, he found the folder again. Title transfer, tax history, one maintenance lien, but no reference to an easement. Still, the marks on the land didn't lie. He rubbed the back of his neck. You seeing this, Echo? The dog nosed his knee, then went to the door, staring toward the cliffs. The wind had risen again, carrying sea spray through the cracks. Mason followed his gaze. Out there, the water looked darker than before, almost oily under the dying light. Tomorrow, he decided. We check it tomorrow. That night, he walked down to the small dock. The moon hung low, fat and white, spilling light across the waves. The island felt separate from the world, no cars, no street lamps, just the rhythmic heartbeat of the sea. Echo stayed at his heel. Somewhere beyond the horizon, lights blinked faintly, cargo ships moving along invisible lanes. He wondered how many of them carried the same cargo he once guarded overseas. Crates whose contents were classified, and whose weight he still felt in his dreams. He thought of the flare again, the one that didn't fire. He'd kept the empty casing in his duffel for years, unable to throw it away. A souvenir of hesitation. Echo brushed against his leg, grounding him. Yeah, Mason said softly. I know. We're still here. He turned toward the lighthouse. The beacon's lens was cracked, but even dead it caught stray light, and reflected it like an eye half open. The whole structure looked ready to fall, yet it still stood a stubborn monument to duty. And that, he realized, was probably why he hadn't left yet. The place was broken but upright, like him. The next morning brought locals. 2 men in reflective vests arrived in a pickup marked County Services. One waved a clipboard. Routine inspection, sir. Safety review for the sale. Mason frowned. Sale? I haven't listed it. The man smiled too easily. Preemptive. Helps expedite future transfers. Echo stood between them, silent, body rigid. Mason signed nothing. He watched them circle the property, take photos, measure the dock, then leave without another word. When he returned to the cottage, a folded note was wedged under the doorframe. "Call us when you're ready to deal. Voss Maritime Holdings." No address, just a number. He flipped the card over. The paper smelled faintly of oil and salt. "Maritime Holdings," he said slowly. "That's no county department." Echo pawed at the floor once, as if seconding the thought. Mason placed the note on the table beside the compass, then stared out at the water, where a thin veil of fog was drawing back over the horizon like a curtain before a show. The day bled into evening. He patched a window, swept out sand, fixed a stripped screw on the lantern stair. Each small repair stitched something inside him together. When the sun dropped behind the sea, he and Echo sat on the steps, sharing quiet as gulls spun overhead. For the first time in months, Mason felt the faint rhythm of purpose, not the old military pulse of command and objective, but something simpler. Hands working, wood creaking, dog breathing. Thunk hadn't stopped echoing in Mason's head since dawn. It came from below the lighthouse, deep and hollow, like the heartbeat of something mechanical buried under stone. By morning, the fog had crept up again, coiling around the cliffs until the horizon disappeared. The air carried the chill of wet iron. Echo paced the kitchen, nails clicking softly against the warped boards, glancing at the door each time Mason shifted his weight. "Yeah, I heard it too," Mason said, pulling on his jacket. "Let's go find your ghost." The lighthouse waited like a patient giant. Dew slicked the metal steps, the handrail cold beneath his fingers. Inside, the spiral stair smelled of old oil and salt. Echo's paws made almost no sound as he climbed beside him, nose twitching. At the top, gray daylight filtered through the cracked glass of the lantern room. The brass ring they'd discovered the night before sat dull and motionless in the center of the floor. Mason crouched beside it, tracing the seam where the pitch had cracked. The surface was smooth except for one thing, a faint indentation shaped like a keyhole just beneath the ring's hinge. He frowned. That wasn't there yesterday. Echo sniffed the metal, ears pinned. His hackles rose, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the scent had memory. Mason ran his thumb along the indentation, then pressed the edge of his multi-tool into it. It caught, then twisted with a dry squeal. The ring popped up half an inch and stopped. Beneath it, a whisper of air rose stale, damp, carrying the faint sweetness of machine oil and the sharper tang of diesel. The hatch wasn't locked anymore. Someone had unsealed it. He looked toward the window. The sea was invisible behind fog, but down below, faint tire tracks marred the sand near the cove, the same area where the silhouettes had appeared last night. Mason's pulse ticked faster. "All right," he murmured to Echo. "If we're crazy, we're both crazy." He hooked his fingers under the ring and lifted. The hatch came free with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow spiral of iron steps descending into black. Echo leaned forward, nose twitching, then looked up at him as if to say, "After you." "Sure," Mason whispered. "Send the human first." He grabbed a flashlight from his belt and started down. The air thickened as he descended. The walls closed in rough concrete, slick with condensation. The smell grew stronger, rust, brine, and something chemical beneath it all. Each step rang softly. Echo followed, paws careful, breathing steady behind him. The stairs ended in a small chamber, lined with riveted panels, each stamped with a naval serial number. Old cables snaked along the ceiling. In the center of the room sat a bulkhead door, its wheel lock streaked with corrosion but intact. Above it, faded white letters read, "Storage, Aux Navigation Unit." Mason wiped grime from the wheel, then turned it. It resisted, then shifted with a heavy clunk. The door opened into a narrow corridor leading to another chamber, a space maybe 20 feet wide. Shelves lined the walls, their metal frames coated in dust. But the shelves weren't empty. Mason's light swept across stacks of metal crates, naval gray, stamped with the same emblem he'd seen on the cliffside stakes. Maritime Reserves Authority, 1,981. Echo padded forward, sniffing a crate's edge. His nose wrinkled, tail stiff. Mason brushed off one label, Archive Log, 47, Bravo. He pried the latch open. Inside lay sealed waterproof pouches, each stamped confidential. Paper old, but dry. He pulled one out, flipped it open. The pages were typewritten, neat, and faintly yellowed. The first line read, "Transfer summary of asset relocations per directive. Meridian, trust, divided by omni, divided by 79. His stomach dropped. He turned another page, columns of numbers, account codes, signatures, and coordinates. Meridian Trust. The same name printed on the card left under his door. He shut the folder quickly and scanned the walls again. Each crate had the same markings, the same codes. It wasn't storage, it was a vault. Echo's low growl rippled through the silence. The dog stood at the far end of the room, staring at a narrow vent near the floor. Something metallic rattled behind it. Mason froze. Then, faintly footsteps. Not above. Outside the bulkhead. He switched off his light, the darkness pressing close. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a muted scrape of metal, someone testing the outer door. Echo crouched low, silent now, body vibrating with tension. Mason's mind ran through options. One exit, one ladder up, a dog, and no weapon but a wrench. Not ideal odds. He slipped back to the stair, keeping to the wall. The bulkhead latch turned once, twice, and stopped. Whoever was out there hadn't forced it yet. A voice murmured, too muffled to make out. Then another voice answered, followed by retreating steps and the soft clink of chains. The sound faded. Mason waited 30 long seconds before exhaling, his pulse still hammered. He climbed back up, Echo at his heels, closing the hatch behind them. At the top, daylight felt unreal, thin and cold. He set the flashlight down and leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breath. They were down there, he said quietly. They were here. Echo pressed against his leg, silent reassurance. He looked out through the cracked window toward the cove. The fog had thinned enough to show faint tracks where the sand met the rocks, tire marks, leading from the waterline toward the service road. Whoever had been here hadn't come by ferry. They'd come by boat. Mason rubbed a hand over his face. So that's the game. He walked back to the cottage, the chill following him inside. He filled the kettle, hands shaking slightly, and watched the water tremble as it heated. Meridian Trust. The name rang like a warning bell. He'd seen similar labels overseas, private contractors who appeared where governments didn't. They funded stabilization efforts, logistical partnerships, all corporate camouflage for something dirtier. He pulled the folded card from his pocket and read the name again. Claudia Voss, Maritime Holdings Division. Same initials. Echo shifted on the floor, head resting on his paws, watching him. You were right, Mason muttered. Something's buried here, and somebody wants it back. He stared at the kettle until it whistled, then shut it off. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, each second pushing him toward a decision he didn't want to make. If he called the sheriff, the wrong ears would hear. The men in vests had looked official too. If he stayed silent, he'd be next on Meridian's list. But the one thing he couldn't do hadn't done, not since the desert was freeze. He grabbed his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote, 1. Vault, 47 Bravo crates. R. Tracks, Terres persons, Cove entry. 3. Name, Meridian Trust. Find link to property. Then he underlined the last line twice. Echo thumped his tail once, the quiet version of approval. Mason looked out the window again. The fog was lifting fast now, revealing the stretch of road leading down to the dock. And there, parked at the edge of his fence line, sat a black SUV. He froze. No county plates. Tinted windows. A woman stepped out, tall, dark coat, hair tied back against the wind. She looked up at the lighthouse and smiled as if she'd been expected. Mason didn't move. She raised a hand in a polite wave. Then, without waiting for an answer, she slipped a white envelope through the gate and returned to the car. The engine hummed, tires crunching gravel, and the vehicle disappeared up the road. Echo barked once short, sharp, then went silent. Mason waited a beat before stepping outside. The envelope lay on the gravel, damp with fog. He picked it up. Inside was a single page. Mr. Hale, what you found belongs to people who prefer the past to remain buried. Let's discuss terms before this becomes unpleasant. C.V. He folded the note carefully, pocketed it, and looked toward the sea. Echo stood beside him, ears forward, tail still. The fog was gone now, and the horizon clear. But far out, just where the waves began to darken, a single boat floated motionless, no lights, no flag. Mason's jaw clenched. Looks like they're not waiting for terms. He turned toward the lighthouse, the weight of decision settling over him like armor. All right, boy, he said softly. We dig on our terms. Echo gave a low huff and started toward the tower. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and something else, diesel fumes, faint but unmistakable. Somewhere out there, engines idled, waiting. Mason followed the dog, his shadow stretching long across the stone path. The hatch below the lantern room was still closed, but now it wasn't just a hole in the floor. It was a doorway one he couldn't ignore anymore. Whatever was buried beneath this island, it wasn't just history. It was bait. The rain arrived before dawn, crawling sideways through cracks in the cottage windows. It was the kind of rain that soaked sound, steady, patient, relentless. Mason woke to the smell of damp salt and the click of Echo's nails moving from room to room, checking perimeters. The dog paused at the door, looked back once, and huffed softly. "I know," Mason muttered, rubbing his eyes. "They're still out there." He hadn't slept much. The letter from Claudia Voss lay on the table beside his notebook, the edges curled from moisture. "Let's discuss terms before this becomes unpleasant." That kind of phrasing didn't come from lawyers. It came from people who decided what was pleasant. He poured a cup of cold coffee and stared at the lighthouse through the window. In daylight, the place looked less mysterious and more like a ruin flaking paint, iron ribs showing through concrete, the lantern glass fractured like an eye that had seen too much. But the hatch under its floor had changed everything. It wasn't just a relic now. It was a wound, and he was part of whatever had festered beneath it. Echo padded to his side, nudged his arm with a damp nose. "Yeah," Mason said quietly. "We'll go back down, just not empty-handed this time." He opened the tool chest by the door and lifted out a heavy crowbar, a flashlight, and his old combat knife, more sentimental than practical. The blade still bore the faint engraving, Hale, M. Corman. He'd carried it through 2 tours, patched up men with less. The weight in his hand was steadying. The lighthouse interior was colder than the air outside. Condensation dripped down its curved walls like sweat. Mason climbed slowly, testing each step for stability. Echo followed without hesitation, tail level, breath controlled. At the top, thin light poured through the cracked panes, scattering across the floor like water. Mason paused, scanning the room. Something glittered faintly near the eastern window, a square of glass cleaner than the rest. He crouched. Scratches formed a faint grid, etched by hand. Tiny notches marked the edges, like coordinates. He held his notebook beside it, tracing the pattern. The grid wasn't random. The lines matched latitude and longitude scales. But the alignment was strange. The 0 line wasn't north. It was angled toward the sea. "Someone used this as a map," he whispered. Echo's nose brushed the glass, fogging it briefly. Mason leaned closer, noticing faint numbers carved into one corner. 47 degrees, 16 N, 122 degrees, 48 W. The same notation had appeared on one of the ledger covers he'd seen in the vault below. He wrote them down, his pulse quickening. Outside, thunder rolled low, far off. The coming storm. The ferry didn't run that day, but Mason had an old skiff tied to the dock. He loaded Echo in the notebook and crossed the short channel to the mainland under bruised clouds. The boat's outboard coughed once and settled into a steady hum. By the time they reached the marina, the town was still half asleep, only a few trucks at the diner, the smell of diesel and coffee mixing in the air. Mason tied off and walked to the records office, Echo trotting close. The clerk at the counter was the same woman who'd warned him about the property overlay. She eyed the mud on his boots and the damp dog beside him. "You again," she said. "Back for more bad news?" "I need property records from the 1,980 seconds, Mason replied. "Specifically, Maritime Reserves Authority." Her expression shifted from casual to cautious. "That's government archive stuff. You sure that's what you want?" He nodded. "And anything on a Meridian Trust. Private holdings, corporate filings, whatever you've got." She hesitated, then disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried a thin binder, yellowed at the corners. "This isn't supposed to be public," she said quietly, "but half the microfilm's gone missing anyway. Most folks don't dig this deep." He flipped through the pages, shipping manifests, fuel deliveries, site leases. One line made him stop. Greywater Lighthouse Facility leaseholder. Maritime Reserves divided by custodian. Jonas Hale, keeper. His uncle. Further down the page. Sublease, 1,980. 1. Meridian Trust Logistics. Mason's chest tightened. "They were using it as cover," he murmured. The clerk frowned. "What kind of cover?" "Storage," he said vaguely. "Probably defense contracts." Her gaze lingered on him. You might want to watch who you ask about those names. Couple of suits were in here last week, pulling microfilm, said they were doing environmental audits. They took whole drawers. Did they leave names? She shook her head. Just a card. Black ink. No logo. He didn't need to see it to know whose it was. As he turned to leave, the woman said, You should think about locking that dog inside at night. Mason paused. Why? She didn't answer. Just looked out the window toward the harbor where a black SUV idled, windshield wipers beating in sync with the rain. The wind had teeth by the time Mason reached the island again. Waves smashed against the rocks like artillery. The sky sagged low and bruised, the air charged with static. Echo bounded ahead, nose to the ground, tail slicing the air in short, deliberate motions. Halfway up the path, the dog stopped, pawing at a patch of shale. Beneath the rocks, Mason saw it a narrow fissure leaking a faint stream of bubbles, rhythmic like a heartbeat. He crouched, pried away debris. A black conduit disappeared into the cliffside, its outer layer coated with barnacle. Electrical? He muttered. No, too small. Echo sniffed the opening, sneezed, then began pacing tight circles. Mason traced the conduit with his flashlight. It vanished toward the waterline. The storm's first drops hissed on the rocks. He followed it down the slope until the tide spray hit his face. There, half buried in sand, a buoy-shaped object protruded from the surf painted orange once, now bleached white. He waded closer. The waves hit hard, freezing around his knees. The buoy was scarred, the top dented inward. He wiped grime away to reveal a faded serial number and a small steel plate stamped, Data Relay, 47B divided by Meridian Network. He stared at it, disbelief tightening his throat. The buoy wasn't navigation, it was a transmission node. Echo barked once, sharp, as lightning ripped across the sky. Mason grabbed the buoy's handle and tugged. It shifted slightly, tethered by a cable leading back toward shore, the same conduit that vanished into the cliff. He followed it up again, wind screaming against his ears. The line ended at a rusted hatch half hidden by rock. He pried it open and found a small metal box the size of a lunch pail, its lights faintly blinking. He wiped the rain from its surface. Power. After all these years, it still had power. Inside the box was a data port and a blinking indicator marked sync pending. The realization hit him like a gut punch. The vault below wasn't dead. It was online. Someone had kept it alive remotely, and they were still listening. The goal shifted in an instant. This wasn't about selling or even protecting the island anymore. It was about exposure. Mason climbed back up the path, soaked to the bone but vibrating with focus. They're running live, he said to Echo, and we just tapped their wire. There, half buried in sand, a buoy-shaped object protruded from the surf painted orange once, now bleached white. He waded closer. The waves hit hard, freezing around his knees. The buoy was scarred, the top dented inward. He wiped grime away to reveal a faded serial number and a small steel plate stamped, Data Relay, 47B divided by Meridian Network. He stared at it, disbelief tightening his throat. The buoy wasn't navigation, it was a transmission node. You've inherited Kaida liability. Liability? The structure sits on disputed land. Government lease, expired decades ago. Technically, you're in violation. He shook his head. Funny county registry doesn't mention that. Her smile never wavered. Not everything official is public. Some records stay where they belong. And Meridian Trust owns those records? For the first time, she blinked. A microsecond of surprise, quickly masked. You've been busy. Busy enough to know you've been trespassing. Rain hissed between them. Echo growled low, chest vibrating. Claudia's gaze flicked to the dog. Beautiful animal, very loyal. I hope you can keep him safe. Mason's fingers tightened around the railing. Was that a threat? An observation, she said smoothly. Our firm prefers diplomacy, Mr. Hale. But time is short. Sell us the property, and this ends quietly. And if I don't? Her smile thinned. Then we resolve ownership by other means. She turned, heels crunching gravel, and walked back to her car. The engine's hum faded into the storm. Mason exhaled slowly. Other means, he muttered. Right. Echo barked once defiant. The storm reached its full fury that night. Rain hammered the roof in sheets, lightning crawling across the horizon like veins of fire. Mason sat by the stove, trying to drown the sound with static from the radio, but every channel was dead. Echo lifted his head suddenly, ears snapping toward the lighthouse. Mason froze, then heard it too, a muffled metallic clang from below, almost lost under the thunder. He grabbed the flashlight and wrench, and together they crossed the slick path to the tower. The door was ajar, swinging in the wind. He hadn't left it that way. Inside, the smell hit first diesel and mud. Footprints streaked the floor, leading toward the hatch. "Stay close," he whispered. Echo's fur bristled. The hatch stood open, the stairwell yawning black. He descended slowly, every step a whisper of metal. Halfway down, light flickered from below flashlights, moving. Voices low and curt. "Take the crate's priority markers first." He recognized the accent. "Private contractors. Eastern European." Mason motioned to Echo to stay. Then he moved closer, crouched behind a steel beam. 3 men, black fatigues, headlamps. One carried a crowbar, another a waterproof case. He watched them load his crates into nylon bags. Then something clattered near the floor. Echo had shifted, tail brushing a loose wrench. The sound was tiny, but the men froze. "Someone's here," one hissed. Mason reacted before thought. He swung the wrench hard against a beam, the clang ricocheting through the chamber like a gunshot. The men spun toward the noise as he cut the power to his flashlight and slipped back up the stairs. "Echo, go," he hissed. The dog bolted toward the tunnel entrance, barking once, drawing their attention. Boots pounded metal. Mason reached the hatch and slammed it shut, locking it with a rusted iron bar. Seconds later, fists pounded from below. He dragged a heavy crate over the hatch, then leaned against the wall, chest heaving. The pounding stopped. Then a single shout rose from below. "We have what we need," followed by silence. When he finally dared to lift the hatch again, the vault was empty. Half the crates were gone. But in their haste, the men had left one behind a decoy crate, smaller than the rest. Mason pried it open. Inside was only rope and a brick for weight. They'd taken the wrong ones. He sat back on the steps, half laughing, half shaking. Echo pressed his muzzle against his hand. "Good diversion," Mason said, voice rough. "We're still in the game." That night, exhaustion caught up. He dreamed of the desert again, the outpost, the burning sky. He could smell the cordite, the scorched sand, the metallic tang of adrenaline. He was back behind the wire, his team pinned down. Radio static screamed. He reached for the flare gun, thumbed the safety, raised it toward the night sky, and hesitated, just half a breath. The wind shifted, the flare misfired, the sky stayed dark. Then the explosion, the sandstorm swallowing sound. 2 voices gone. He woke gasping, sweat cold on his back. Echo's head rested on his knee, eyes calm. "I froze," Mason whispered, "and I swore I never would again." He wiped his face, stood, and looked toward the lighthouse. Lightning still flickered beyond the glass. The storm had passed its peak. Tomorrow, he'd move the evidence. At dawn, he took the skiff back to town, crates hidden under tarp. The air smelled of ozone and burnt seaweed. The ferry pier was empty except for a woman in scrubs smoking a cigarette under the awning. "Storm didn't like you either, huh?" she said as he tied off. "Could have been worse," he replied. She nodded toward the crate. "That looks heavy." "Just repairs," he lied. She smiled faintly. "You don't strike me as the repair type. You look like someone holding a secret too long." Her name was Marin. She ran the island clinic, small, underfunded, and usually empty. When Mason mentioned his radio troubles, she offered, "We've got a shortwave for emergencies. I can open it after hours if you need to send something off island." He hesitated. Trust was a currency he rarely spent. But something in her tone, direct, unbothered, cut through his caution. "Tomorrow," he said, "might take you up on that." The next night, the silence felt wrong. Too deep. Even the wind had paused. Mason couldn't shake the feeling of eyes in the dark. He stepped outside. The fog pressed close, thick and heavy. Echo trotted ahead, sniffing the ground. Near the fence line, something caught the flashlight beam, a scrap of fabric, red and damp. Blood. His chest tightened. "Echo?" The dog barked from the cliffs. Relief crashed through him as he saw the shape moving toward him, limping slightly but alive. Echo's flank was streaked with mud, not blood. Attached to his collar was something Mason hadn't put there, a small metal disc etched with numbers. He held it up to the light. The same coordinates from the window grid. The dog had found it, or someone had put it on him. Either way, it meant he wasn't alone in this fight. He spent the next hour digging through the foghorn shed, tracing wires, following Echo's nose. Beneath a layer of dust and canvas, he found a battery rack still warm. He lifted it, revealing a hidden panel of blinking diodes. A backup server. It wasn't just Meridian storing data offshore, they had mirrored it right here under his floor. He almost laughed from disbelief. "You're telling me the whole truth's been humming under my nose?" Echo wagged once, quiet affirmation. Mason stared at the lights until his reflection stared back, a man pulled between hiding and exposure. Then he made his choice. He'd expose them. All of them. By morning, he had a plan. He hauled the remaining ledgers and hard drives to the keeper's office, connected them to the backup panel, and began transferring everything to portable storage. Rain tapped the roof like fingers urging him to hurry. Lines of text filled the screen: transactions, shell accounts, offshore routes. Each line mapped to the same names in the vault. Then a new folder appeared. Beneficiaries, Archive. He opened it and froze. The first page listed payments to families of disaster victims. The second listed names he recognized from old service rosters, and the third his teammate's widow. Meridian had stolen from relief funds, from soldiers' pensions, from people who never knew to look. His uncle had tried to bury the proof, not to hide it, but to keep it from predators. Mason's throat tightened. The anger came slow, steady, like heat rising through metal. He copied everything to 3 drives, one for backup, one for insurance, one for exposure. When the process finished, he knelt beside Echo and scratched the dog's neck. "We're not hiding anymore." Outside, thunder rolled again, not from the sky this time, but from engines. The convoy was back. He looked through the window and saw 2 trucks cresting the hill, headlights cutting through the mist. Echo growled, teeth flashing white. "All right," Mason whispered, standing tall. "Round 2. The trucks halted just beyond the fence, their engines growling like something alive. Wind carried the smell of diesel and mud. The storm had rolled inland but left behind a sky streaked in bruised violet, the air heavy and charged. Mason Hale stood at the window of the keeper's cottage, jaw tight, eyes following the glint of metal along the truck beds. The men who stepped out didn't bother with pretense black jackets, tactical boots, earpieces tucked beneath rain-slick hoods. Meridian's private security, not county inspectors this time. Echo pressed against Mason's leg, trembling not in fear, but restraint. The dog's gaze fixed on the path leading to the lighthouse. The vault, the proof. "They want the drives," Mason said quietly. "They can't have them." He slung his duffel across his shoulder, stuffed with the copied data, and checked the window again. Claudia Voss climbed from the lead truck, calm as if stepping onto a red carpet. Her coat whipped in the wind. Her hair, pinned in place, didn't move at all. "Mr. Hale," she called, voice carrying unnaturally clear. "Let's not make this difficult." Mason stepped onto the porch, keeping one hand near his belt, the other resting on Echo's collar. "You brought quite the crowd for a conversation," he said. "We've had our share of misunderstandings," she replied. "This can still end peacefully. Hand over the materials you removed from our facility and you walk away. Not charges, not consequences." He laughed once, low. "You mean from my lighthouse?" Claudia's smile didn't waver. "Your family was a custodian, not an owner. Your uncle signed government custodial agreements before his departure. That property, and everything beneath it, belongs to Meridian Trust." Mason shook his head slowly. "Funny, your people didn't seem to think it belonged to you when they buried it." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're holding." "Oh, then maybe you should have left it buried." A flick of her hand, a signal. 2 of the men began moving toward the lighthouse path. Echo growled, low and rumbling, stepping forward before Mason's quiet, "Stay." Claudia's tone hardened. "We'll retrieve our assets. You should stay inside, Mr. Hale. This is out of your depth." Mason's hand tightened on the railing. "You're right," he said, "but I don't drown easy." He turned, heading down the side path toward the cliffs, Echo at his heel. The next night, the silence felt wrong, too deep. Even the wind had paused. Mason couldn't shake the feeling of eyes in the dark. He stepped outside. The fog pressed close, thick and heavy. Echo trotted ahead, sniffing the ground. Near the fence line, something caught the flashlight beam, a scrap of fabric, red and damp. Blood. His chest tightened. "Echo?" The dog barked from the cliffs. Relief crashed through him as he saw the shape moving toward him, limping slightly but alive. The next night, the silence felt wrong, too deep. Even the wind had paused. Mason couldn't shake the feeling of eyes in the dark. He stepped outside. The fog pressed close, thick and heavy. Echo trotted ahead, sniffing the ground. Near the fence line, something caught the flashlight beam, a scrap of fabric, red and damp, blood. His chest tightened. Echo? The dog barked from the cliffs. Relief crashed through him as he saw the shape moving toward him, limping slightly but alive. Through the cracked door, he saw flashlight beams weaving through the fog. 3, maybe 4 men searching the path. He scanned the equipment. No antenna big enough for broadband. Only one option left: the lighthouse beacon itself. He grabbed the portable power pack, stuffed it under his arm, and pointed toward the tower. "Come on, boy." Echo bounded ahead, splashing through puddles. The storm's edge returned just as they reached the lighthouse. Rain lashed the glass, turning every beam of light into a smear. Mason powered the emergency switch. The generator coughed, sputtered, then caught. The beacon light rotated once, a pale ghost of what it had been. Below, shadows approached through the haze. Mason could hear the radio's bursts of static, clipped orders. He moved fast, connecting the beacon's wiring into the relay. Sparks popped. "Come on, come on." Echo barked sharply, 2 figures rounding the bend, rifles raised. Mason ducked behind the lens, heart pounding. Bullets cracked against metal, glass shattered. He slammed the control lever down. The beacon roared to life, brighter than it had in decades. Its beam swept across the cove, blinding the men below for a split second. Mason seized the chance, climbing down the spiral stair, pulling Echo with him. They reached the subfloor hatch just as the door upstairs burst open. Shouts echoed down the stairwell. Mason yanked the hatch shut and bolted it from below. "That buys us a minute," he muttered. The backup inverter hummed louder. Data began pulsing through the beacon's frequency, encoded light signals transmitting the files outward. He watched the tiny monitor flicker. Transfer, 54%. Outside, thunder cracked so close, it shook the walls. Then silence. Echo's ears twitched. He looked up, alert. Mason killed the generator, listening. The men had stopped shooting. That was worse. He turned back to the monitor. Transfer, 78%. A metallic clatter above the sound of a crowbar hitting the hatch. They'd found another way in. Mason's flashlight beam caught a shadow moving through the broken stairwell, one of the contractors lowering himself by rope. Another followed. He reached for the flare gun in his pack, then froze. The last time he'd used one, it hadn't fired. He took a breath, forced the memory back where it belonged. Not this time. The hatch above cracked open. Echo snarled, a sound deep and primal. The first man dropped through, rifle swinging toward Mason. Echo lunged, teeth flashing. The gun fired once wood splintered, the shot wide. The dog hit the man squarely, dragging him down. Mason turned, fired the flare. The gun belched light and heat, the crimson blaze streaking through the chamber before striking the open generator panel. Fire bloomed bright, blinding, oxygen snarling. The intruders shouted, disoriented. "Echo, move." They scrambled up the spiral stairs as the chamber filled with smoke. The heat chased them upward, each breath scraping Mason's throat raw. When they reached the lantern room, the flare's glow pulsed through the glass like a second sunrise. The monitor on his wrist, jury-rigged to the beacon's frequency, flashed, "Transfer complete." He stumbled to the railing, coughing, and looked out. On the horizon, faint lights blinked back Coast Guard distress channels responding to the emergency flare pattern. The coded pulses he'd embedded in the beacon were broadcasting across maritime bands. He'd done it. The data was out. Below, the remaining contractors retreated to the trucks, shouting into radios. Claudia stood by the fence, staring up at the blazing beacon, her face pale in the red light. She raised a phone to her ear, listening. Her expression shifted from fury to something colder: calculation. Then she turned, barking an order, and the trucks roared to life, speeding toward the dock. Mason leaned on the railing, exhausted. Echo limped to his side, panting, muzzle streaked with soot. He smiled weakly. "That'll do, partner, that'll do." The fire below was dying now, choked by rain pouring through shattered glass. The smell of salt and burnt metal mingled in the air. They stayed there until the sirens came. Morning broke slow, gray, and clean. Coast Guard cutters hovered offshore, their lights blinking against the fog. Mason sat on the steps of the lighthouse wrapped in a blanket. Echo curled beside him, half asleep. The agents had been thorough cordoning off the vault, confiscating what remained, escorting Claudia Voss and her men onto the boats in handcuffs. She didn't look at him as she passed, though one corner of her mouth twitched, not defeat, not quite admiration. "You'll make enemies," one of the Coast Guard officers warned him quietly. "Wouldn't be my first time," Mason said. The drives he'd uploaded had gone viral overnight. Media outlets called it the Meridian Leak. The documents detailed 40 years of corporate siphoning billions in relief funds, laundered through ghost charities and offshore freight routes. His uncle's name appeared not as a thief, but as the auditor who'd sealed the evidence away to keep it from disappearing. Mason hadn't inherited a fortune. He'd inherited a responsibility. He looked at the lighthouse now, its charred glass already replaced with temporary panels. For the first time in years, he didn't see ruin. He saw foundation. When the government offered him restitution, he refused. Instead, he asked for one thing: rights to the property permanently, publicly. 3 months later, construction crews arrived. Bulldozers cleared debris, workers laid stone for new cabins, a dock for medical boats. The Greywater Renewal Foundation opened under his supervision, funded by recovered assets from Meridian's seized accounts. Veterans came from across the state, men and women carrying invisible wounds like his. They built, repaired, shared silence that didn't hurt. Echo became their sentinel mascot, gray at the muzzle now, eyes still sharp. He patrolled the grounds like he understood what the place had become. Sometimes, when the fog rolled in and the beacon lit the mist red, Mason felt the same pulse that had filled him in the field: adrenaline, focus, life. But now it carried no fear. He kept one relic in the lantern room, a spent flare casing mounted on the wall. Beneath it, a small brass plate read, "Fired when it mattered." Morning broke slow, gray, and clean. Coast Guard cutters hovered offshore, their lights blinking against the fog. Mason sat on the steps of the lighthouse wrapped in a blanket. Echo curled beside him, half asleep. The agents had been thorough cordoning off the vault, confiscating what remained, escorting Claudia Voss and her men onto the boats in handcuffs. She didn't look at him as she passed, though one corner of her mouth twitched, not defeat, not quite admiration. Echo looked out toward the sea, tail thumping once, slow and sure. Below, lights flickered on across the cottages, warm, steady, human. For the first time, the island didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. Mason turned toward the lantern, now automated and flawless. Its light swept across the waves, tracing a perfect arc into the distance. Far out, ships blinked in reply, one after another, until the horizon looked stitched with stars. He smiled. "That's more like it." Echo settled beside him, head resting on Mason's boot. The sea breathed against the rocks in an even rhythm. Legacy wasn't about inheritance, Mason thought. It was about stewardship, about standing guard until the next hand was ready. He glanced at the flare casing one last time, the brass glinting in the lantern glow, then at the horizon where dawn would rise again soon enough. The dog's tail gave a final, lazy wag, and Mason's smile deepened. "Come on, partner," he said. "We've got a light to keep." By late winter, the island learned his footsteps. The path from the keeper's cottage to the tower held his weight without complaint. The door hinges only whispered now. Mason Hale paused outside the lantern room and let the cold slide under his collar. It was a clean cold, like a fresh page. Below, cabins glowed with soft light. A handful of veterans moved between them with tool belts and coffee. No orders, but there was rhythm. Work at your own speed. Step in when a hand stalls. Echo patrolled the boardwalk, pausing at doorways as if counting heads. He never barked without cause. He didn't need to anymore. Mason's shoulder twinged old metal, speaking in isobars before the weather. He rubbed it once and climbed. The lens greeted him with its breathy rotation, the glass reclaimed and polished until it held a piece of dawn even at night. He rested a palm on the housing. The hum answered back, steady as a pulse at rest. She carried a box of laminates orientation packets, emergency contacts, a map with all the places a person could breathe. "New cohort checks in at 4, she said. "You want to say something, or should I?" "I'll keep it short," he said. "They didn't come for speeches." She smiled. "They came for the dog." Echo had found them both at the railing, tail swinging slow, woolly ears up, muzzle silvered more than fall. Echo settled beside him, head resting on Mason's boot. The sea breathed against the rocks in an even rhythm. Legacy wasn't about inheritance, Mason thought. It was about stewardship, about standing guard until the next hand was ready. He glanced at the flare casing one last time, the brass glinting in the lantern glow, then at the horizon where dawn would rise again soon enough. The dog's tail gave a final, lazy wag, and Mason's smile deepened. "Come on, partner," he said. He leaned his shoulder into Mason's knee the way he did when words risked running ahead of sense. Marin set the box down, gaze drifting to the horizon where a freighter slid south. Neat as a thought. Press called again, she added. They want a quote about redemption. Mason huffed softly. I was a corpsman. I patched holes. Redemption's a heavier lift. What would you call it? He watched Echo study the stairs, eyes measuring every rise and run before committing a step. Maintenance, he said. On people. On places. Keep the lights in spec. Replace what fails. Admit when you need a second pair of hands. She nodded as if that word had been waiting between them all winter. Maintenance, she repeated. I can live with that. They stood without filling the quiet. Outside, the sea wore its easiest face. The island breathed. Gulls, hammers, a laugh that surprised the mouth it came from. Mason felt the old, thin space where second-guessing used to live and found it occupied by a sturdier weight. Not certainty. Direction. Before the cohort, Marin said, I want you to see something. She held out a single laminate edges, rough, the ink imperfect. The title read, Greywater Stewardship Trust. Under it, names in small type. Beneficiaries, board, custodians. Not one line hid in initials or shells. At the bottom, a signature in his own hand, flanked by two more hers and the mechanics who had lent them the first ham radio. Mason traced the word custodian with his thumb. The old misbelief distance keeps them safe, didn't lift or shatter. It changed shape, like a knot softened by weather until it agreed to be part of the rope. He cleared his throat. Looks official. It is, she said, and very boring to defraud. That drew his first real laugh of the morning. Good. The boring should outlast us. A faint sound drifted through the glass, 3 quick notes from the foghorn across the channel. Training signal. Echo's ears flicked, then settled. No alarm. Just the island checking in with itself. Mason leaned on the rail. There's an old thing my uncle said once, he offered. I didn't get it then. What was it? A light isn't brave, he said. It just points the way until someone else does the brave part. Marin watched the beam turn. You think that's true? Some days, he said. Other days, the light is the brave part. They fell quiet again. A truck door shut below. The new cohort had arrived. Faces he didn't know yet. Shoulders carrying stories he wouldn't ask to hear before the coffee warmed. Echo rose and headed down, confident as a seasoned usher. Marin gathered the box. You coming? In a minute. She disappeared into the stairwell. The lens sighed past, dividing the world into facets for a breath, then returning it whole. Mason glanced at the flare casing, at the brass letters that named the moment he'd chosen to be the man on the stairs and not the man at the hatch. He thought of his teammates, of the long dark he'd walked since, and of the sea that refused to be one thing for long. He imagined each person below as a lantern trimmed and tended, light coaxed from smoke and patience. A gull rode a column of air just beyond the glass, motionless in motion. Mason smiled. Maintenance, he said to the room. We can do that. He started down. Halfway, he paused an old habit listening. Not for danger, for alignment. Waves against rock. Voices. Echoes nails on wood. Steady. Counted. Home. And from the radio clipped to the wall, a crackle, a distant vessel requesting guidance through fog not yet formed. Routine. Nothing urgent. Mason keyed the mic. Greywater Light, copy. We see you. Echo looked back up the stairs, waiting. Stand by, Mason added, a touch of warmth under the words. We'll keep you in the beam. He clipped the radio back, squared his shoulders, and took the last steps down into his work. The lens turned, the island answered, and the day began.